The Lord be with you. A reading from the Holy Gospel according to Luke. Tax collectors and sinners were all drawing near to listen to Jesus. But the Pharisees and scribes began to complain, saying, "This man welcomes sinners and eats with them." So to them, Jesus addressed this parable. A man had 2 sons. And the younger son said to his father, "Father, give me the share of your estate that should come to me." So the father divided the property between them. And after a few days, the younger son collected all his belongings and set off to a distant country, where he squandered his inheritance on a life of dissipation. When he had freely spent everything, a severe famine struck that country, and he found himself in dire need. So he hired himself out to one of the local citizens, who sent him to his farm to tend the swine. And he longed to eat his fill of the pods on which the swine fed, but nobody gave him any. Coming to his senses, he thought, "How many of my father's hired workers have more than enough food to eat? But here am I, dying from hunger. I shall get up and go to my father, and I shall say to him, 'Father, I have sinned against heaven and against you. I no longer deserve to be called your son. Treat me as you would treat one of your hired workers.' So he got up and went back to his father. While he was still a long way off, his father caught sight of him, and filled with compassion, he ran to his son, embraced him, and kissed him. His son said to him, 'Father, I have sinned against heaven and against you. I no longer deserve to be called your son.' But his father ordered his servants, 'Quickly, bring the finest robe and put it on him. Put a ring on his finger and sandals on his feet. Take the fattened calf and slaughter it. Then let us celebrate with a feast, because this son of mine was dead and has come to life again. He was lost and has been found.' Then the celebration began. Now, the older son had been out in the field, and on his way back, as he neared the house, he heard the sound of music and dancing. He called one of the servants and asked what this might mean. The servant said to him, 'Your brother has returned, and your father has slaughtered the fattened calf because he has him back safe and sound.' He became angry, and when he refused to enter the house, his father came out and pleaded with him. He said to his father in reply, 'Look, all these years I served you, and not once did I disobey your orders. Yet you never even gave me a young goat to feast on with my friends. But when your son returns, who swallowed up your property with prostitutes, for him you slaughter the fattened calf.' He said to him, 'My son, you are here with me always. Everything I have is yours. But now we must celebrate and rejoice, because your brother was dead and has come to life again. He was lost and has been found.'" The Gospel of the Lord. Praise to you, Lord Jesus Christ. Someone was telling me this morning that once upon a time, there was a faith formation teacher with her 3rd grade class teaching the children this story of the prodigal son. And as she taught them, she said, "Now when the son came home and the father was so happy and they had a party, there was someone who was not happy." Who was not happy? Yes, who was not happy? The fattened calf. Probably. This holy season of Lent, which we are in the middle of, is a season in which we are embraced and surrounded and held so beautifully and gently in God's love and mercy. And that may not be your first image of a season that started out 3.5 weeks ago with images about rending your clothes and rending your heart and getting ashes and trying to discover where you're broken. I've been talking about our wretchedness and all these things. You usually don't think, oh, well, that must mean that this is all about love and God's love for us. But it absolutely is. It absolutely is. And I think the story we are given today, the parable Jesus tells of the prodigal son, informs that reality of the season and what the season calls us to. Now, if you're not familiar with the word prodigal, I mean, we hear it all the time attached to this man. Prodigal is a word that means recklessly extravagant or overly abundant, lavish kind of thing. And at some point, somewhere, someone attached that adjective to the son, presumably because he was recklessly extravagant with the fortune, with the inheritance that his father gave him. Personally, as I shared with those of you who are here for our mission, I think this parable needs a new name. I think this is the parable of the prodigal father, of the recklessly extravagant father, who is recklessly extravagant not only with the inheritance he gives to his son, but with his love, with his forgiveness, with his grace, with his mercy, with his compassion, with his joy, with his excitement. At every point in this parable, the father goes well beyond anything that any reasonable dad would have done, especially in that place and that time. But that's really the whole point of the parable that Jesus gives us. It's not a parable so much about the son or the older brother as it is about God and how God responds to us in our brokenness, in our sinfulness, and how God always welcomes us back. But I'm getting way ahead of myself. This parable comes in Luke chapter 15. And Luke is the only one who records this parable for us. It's the longest of the parables that Jesus ever tells. And in Luke 15, there's also two other little teeny parables. The parable about the shepherd who has 100 sheep and loses one and leaves 99 behind to go find the lost one. And also there's the parable of the woman who has 10 coins and loses one, lights a lamp, sweeps the house, and finds the one that is missing. So those three parables are supposed to speak to us together, and we'll get there. But in this parable of the prodigal son, or recklessly extravagant father, what we have really is a man who loses both his sons. He loses one to a faraway country, and he loses the other one, even though that son stays at home. In a sense, the relationship that the father enjoys with both his sons gets broken by decisions and actions on the part of the sons. The younger son comes to the father, as you heard, and demands his share of the inheritance. As I've said before, it's as though he said to his father, I want my inheritance, I wish you were dead, give it to me now. And the father does that. And he goes off and spends that money in a faraway country, enjoying it with, according to the older brother, prostitutes, with other people. That tends to be the way things work, is that we enjoy our sinning with other people, but ultimately what happens is the price for the sin ends up getting paid alone. And so there he is, a famine hits the land, he's run out of money, so his friends have run out on him, and he ends up being a young Jewish kid who has turned his life literally into a pig pen. Literally. There he is. And then he has a realization. He has the realization that, in my father's house, people are eating plenty. So it sounds almost selfish, if you will. He goes, I can do better if I just go home and even be a servant in my dad's house. So that'll be my play. That's what I will do. I will go home and say to my father, I have sinned against heaven and against you. I'm no longer worthy to be called your son. Treat me as a hired hand. And he gets up and heads for home. Then we begin to see just exactly how remarkable the father is if giving the inheritance wasn't enough to start with. Because at that time, in that part of the world, a patriarch of a family, and apparently this was a rich family in the parable, would have been at home doing his thing, maybe wondering if the son would ever come back or not. But we're told that while the son is a long way off, the father spots him, which means he's looking for him. He hasn't given up hope on his son. It's still there. And when he sees his son, he's moved with compassion. Now, in the scriptures, whenever that word comes up, compassion is a much more powerful sort of response than you and I might normally think of when we hear compassion. It doesn't just mean to feel empathetic towards someone or to feel very sorry for them. But the idea of compassion in the scriptures is that when someone feels compassion, as Jesus often does, or someone feels pity, as Jesus often does, it is literally a visceral response. It involves the viscera, out of the bowels. The entirety of one's being just responds emotionally, physically, in every way possible to what they are seeing, to what they are experiencing, to the point that not responding isn't a choice. It's one of those moments that just drives you. You would probably experience that sort of thing if you saw a family member of yours get hurt or fall. Even before you can respond, you're responding. Before you've even thought it through, there's just this reaction. That's what the father in the parable has. This patriarch who should probably be sitting at home going, oh, here he comes, let's see how this plays out. Instead goes, oh, my son! And he's off like a shot. He's off like a shot. He hugs him, he kisses him, he embraces him. And when the son says, I'm no longer fit to be called your son, he says, quick, bring a finest robe, bring a ring, bring a sandal. All things that would say to the son, you are still my son. I don't care what you're saying, you're no longer my son. You are still my son. As a matter of fact, take the fattened calf, kill it. I order a party. This son of mine was lost. He took my money, he spent it, he sinned with it, he broke relationship with me, he broke relationship with God, he used it on prostitutes, and we're going to have a party. It's insanity. In the first parish I was at, All Saints in Hayward, there was a beautiful woman there. She was one of the pillars of the church, energetic in her faith, who had a real relationship with God. And my very first year as a priest, I was preaching on this gospel, and before the Mass, she came to me, she said, I can hardly wait to hear what you have to say. And I said, why? And she said, well, I think the gospel is wrong. Oh, really? Why is the gospel wrong? She said, look, I get it. He's family. You always take family back. But to throw him a party? And I think that's probably where most of us would fall. We would agree with that entirely. Yes, he's family. Bring him back. But since you're coming back, let me now explain to you how things are going to work in this house. Here's how you're going to have to behave yourself if you want to stay here. And if you fail once, you're back out. Right? That's much more how we would work as human beings. What Jesus is trying to reveal to us is that God's divine and not human. And the response of the Father isn't to give any kind of moral lecture or any kind of requirements. The Father is simply overjoyed. That's what all three of the parables, the shepherd, the woman, and the father, the prodigal son, is trying to teach us. And the other two little short parables about the shepherd who loses the sheep and the woman who loses the coin, the focus is on once they find it, they are jubilant. They invite friends in to rejoice with them. They're filled with joy over what was lost has now been found. That's what Jesus is driving home more than anything else, is that God rejoices mightily when we return, when he welcomes us home. I mean, think about that for a second. If we do our Lenten work and return to the Father, what we end up doing in Lent is we make God rejoice. We can do that. We can delight the heart of God. God can order a festival on our behalf. God rejoices when we do that. The father in the parable representing God, all merciful, all embracing. All you got to do is come on home. All you got to do is come on home. And then we get to the older son, who, as many of us, might have a problem with the situation. Look at what's gone on here. Your son has gone through your money with prostitutes. Here I have been my entire life, doing everything you asked of me. True. True. The older son's life looks to be the better life. Looks to be the one who's obedient, who is self-sacrificing, who is faithful to the Father. But unfortunately, his doing all that has led him to a place of deep resentment, a place of selfishness, a place of anger that prevents him from celebrating the remarkable change in his younger brother's life. And again, the father goes out to the son who's having the problem and tries to affirm for him, you are loved, and everything I have is yours. And nothing's changed about that. It's always been that way. It always will be that way. Can't you find it in yourself to rejoice that your younger brother's realizing that? Can't you? And of course, the hook for the parable is, we don't know if the older brother does. We don't know if he ever goes into the party. Right? Jesus is telling this to the scribes and the Pharisees, those people who would be the older brother. Can't you rejoice because sinners are finding their way back to God? We don't know, because that's a decision the scribes, the Pharisees, or sometimes even we need to make. Even we need to make. But the key moment in the parable, at least what speaks to me in this Lenten season, in my Lenten journey, is the moment when the younger son, bereft of everything in the pig pen, comes to his senses. Comes to his senses. For those of you at the mission, I checked. It is Greek. And in the Greek, that phrase has this idea. He doesn't just come to his senses. He comes home to himself. He realizes who he is. So this going back to the Father is not a selfish play to try to get himself out of his problem. He realizes who he is. And what happens when that occurs? Well, it's hard to tell what's going on in the fictional mind of a fictional character. But based on the words Jesus puts on his mouth, he realizes his sin. He realizes that's all he has left. His sin is his. I have sinned. And he recognizes that everything he ever had is from his Father, and that he needs to go try to righten that situation. I don't know about you, but speaking for myself, I get that. When you come to your senses at last and realize who you truly are, not called to be people who live in sin, but called to be children, daughters and sons of the Father. I know by faith that anything good that starts in me, any impulse in that direction to do something positive or something noble or something whatever, is the movement of God's Spirit in me, which I try to cooperate with as much as I can. And that the only thing in my life that is truly 100% pure Mark Wiesner is my sin. That's the only thing that is 100% me. And when I come to my senses at last, when I come back to myself, I realize that as real as that sin is, that's not who I am. And that's not who I'm supposed to be. That God calls me, God calls us to be people who can bear fruit, as we talked about with the fig tree last week. As people who do good deeds, as people who are noble, as people who are bound for glory. And so we get ourselves up and we go back to the Father who is waiting for us with open arms. As a matter of fact, this entire extraordinary Jubilee of Mercy, the theme for the year is taken from the example of the Father in this scripture. We are called to be merciful like the Father. And when we return to God, well aware of what I own 100%, that experience of mercy, that experience of love is the start of true conversion within my life. All of this takes place in the context, as I said at the beginning, of God's love for us. That our brokenness, our wretchedness, our sinfulness, what's 100% our own, is embraced in love so that we can start again. Doesn't mean I won't sin again. I'll probably sin before I get out that door today, right? But it means I'm no longer saying, I want what's mine, I'm going to walk away from God the Father. But I keep working now in this direction, and even if I stumble and fall, there's love, there's joy, there's mercy for me. It's a remarkable story that tells us exactly how joyful God is when we return, and why this season of Lent is a joyful season and a season embraced by love. May we never take for granted God's mercy the way the older son does. And may we never take advantage of God's mercy the way the younger son does. But isn't it lovely to know that if we do, and should we come to our senses, that God waits with open arms, ready to welcome us back and to throw a feast.